Now, I think at this late stage in the conference, I'm going to make an attempt to give some kind of a synoptic vision, as foolhardy as that seems, and address our topic, theology and the arts, which certainly there's a kind of tension built into those terms, especially in our secular culture today. They seem to be opposites in so many ways. One has to leave theology behind in order to, it seems. Of course, we're giving the counter-evidence in, I think, many, if not all, of the approaches that are being proposed here. And nevertheless, this has been a very uneasy, even strained relationship, even through the course of history. We can even go back to the Middle Ages. In high scholasticism, we do have the treatise by Bonaventure, De Reductione Artium ad Theologiam, and placing theology as the queen of the arts, that is, the arts and sciences. And I do want to understand arts as the creative arts, the performing arts, also the liberal arts, arts and humanities. I think that very much in this relationship between theology and the arts, the whole nature of knowledge in the humanities is at stake, especially if we talk about negative theology, not the positive doctrines of one creed or another, but the space, the wide open space from which theology and all of the arts come, all of them actually. That's this apophatic space referred to by Peter that I will try to open some kind of access to in order to contemplate some kind of a common derivation for arts and theology. There is something, I repeat, provocative about this in a world where typically the projects in the humanities are de-theologizing this field or that field, right? If we can put the knowledge in any of these fields on the demystified basis of purely secular principles, then we can understand things lucidly. And I think, like most of you, I'm convinced that that doesn't really work, that theology is crucial to our understanding of arts, humanities, and science as well, incidentally, as part of the larger curriculum. Arts and sciences go together in our liberal arts curriculum, and in fact, I think we have to understand the whole of them from the paradigm of the humanities rather than of the sciences. Typically, we take the sciences as the paradigm of genuine knowledge, and we extend it, and it becomes more subjective and messy as you get to the arts. But in so many ways, our knowledge is human first and foremost. That's what we have to look at, even in contemplating science. In what ways is it a human knowledge ensconced in human relationships? Now, to begin contemplating all of this, I would like to turn to poetry's anthropological origins in orgiastic rites, religious cults, and sacred dance, as well as in divination, magical spells, and incantations. And all of these, in some sense, are forms of revelation, I believe. I'm going to speak more specifically about arts and theology, but poetry and prophecy most specifically. And if we take the vocabulary for prophecy early on, we have vates in Latin, which covers both the poet and the prophet. It's the word for prophet. The same really goes for the Sanskrit word kavi, which I think is cognate with vates. It embraces both of these domains, functions, modalities, and the same can be said as well for the Hebrew word nabi, which sounds as if it is cognate. I don't really suppose it is, although maybe there is some sort of universal linguistic constant. And this word nabi literally means a bubbling forth as from a fountain. It's the word in the Hebrew Scriptures for prophet, but you can tell by the images that are entailed in it that it's very much about poetic expression as well, as are the Hebrew prophets Amos, Isaiah, Elijah, Ezekiel. They're writing in parables, proverbs, and even love songs. So in primordial cultures worldwide, I think we find this original indifferentiation of the offices of poet and prophet, and this extends even to figures like the shaman or the wizard, Merlin. They too can don the mantle of the prophet or the poet, and some other variations on those as well, in this undecidability between religious revelation, spiritual experience on one side, and creative imagination or poetic invention on the other. And of course, in our modern secular cultures, we've tended to differentiate, to sectorialize. But when we go back, we find that the two really are reciprocal and symbiotic, and maybe they still are or ought to be for us today. Certainly this has been the case in history. The revelatory and the rhetorical belong absolutely together as the common matrix of the oldest and most fundamental modes of expression of humanity across cultures. The primary sources of religious revelation are quite generally poetic texts, even consummately poetic texts. We know this about the Bible. It's certainly the case for the Quran, for the Vedic Shruti, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, the Buddhist Sutra as well. The Taoist and Confucian classics as well are literary classics as well as authoritative religious texts, and even national legends, folk, epics, the West African Bayajida, the Navajo creation myth, Dine, Bahane, the story of the people, have this same ambidextrous quality to them. And I'm sure it would go for Aboriginal cultures as well. The Dreamtime, I'm going to defer to some of you, I think, to fill us in on that. Now, moving in the opposite direction, we find that the monumental works of individual creative poets are also very often primary sources for spiritual awakening, for cultivating religious sensibilities. The highest and most sublime works of poets, those distinguished by the richest imaginative elaboration and verbal density, very often lay claim to transmitting some kind of divine revelation. This is true of the epic works of Homer, appealing to the divine muse, Virgil, Dante, Milton, and Klopstock in Western tradition, but also the Mahabharata as the source text of Indian religion, and even in less strict, solemn ways of the mythologies and religious histories of the Puranas. Much of the devotional bhakti poetry of India or the mystic Sufi poetry of Persia, furthermore, tends to exceed the cadre of creative compositions by individual artistic talents. They tend to aspire to become works of a more authoritative status, as specimens of revelation, and to become canonical and scriptural in various ways. The medieval cosmological poets, Bernard Sylvestris, his Cosmographia, Alain de Lille, the Anti-Claudianus, are making religious revelation explicitly their source as poets. And this extends then into the modern period, early modern period. We know John of the Cross, Thomas Traherne, Salesius Angelus. These are spiritual poets of the very highest degree, and there's some kind of a revelation. Of course, there are a lot of distinctions to be made about the kind of authority, and yet there are continuities as well. It can be extended further. All of you have your own poets in mind as well. I'm I'm going to recur to some of these figures a little bit later, maybe just to give us a point of arrival. Prophetic claims and tones continue to be asserted in the 20th century avant-garde manifestos of Futurism, Dadaism, Hugo Ball, and in Stefan Georg's modernist religion of art. Now, I will go forward by the end of this paper to Walt Whitman, and I would mention perhaps Allen Ginsberg as well, Howell, as an example of a contemporary poet with some kind of a claim to being a contemporary prophetic poet. The core phenomenon that we're dealing with in all of these cases is some kind of divine revelation in and through human art. Poetry, both sacred and profane, very often demands to be understood as called forth by some higher agency than that of the poets themselves. God or divinity, such as the muses, are held to summon certain mortals to serve as instruments of their communications. There are many poets who are intimates of the gods. This is Orpheus. He was given his lyre and taught to play it by the god Apollo. So poetry is interpreted as a channel of divine vision, reaching beyond ordinary sight of mortals and issuing in inspired speech. This uncanny awareness connects by heavenly inspiration or perhaps madness with a higher transcendent source of consciousness. This constitutes its claim to being a revealed type of knowing. But poetic expression thus can turn in the direction of claiming to reveal truth concerning divine things, or at least meaning of a religious order concerning worldly and human beings seen in the light of divine revelation. Yet poetry is also essentially a free creative production of human beings. It's an art serving for expression of what is most deeply and intimately human. So the artistry of language as poiesis is produced by a human act of meaning. This is the other side of the equation that we can't forget when we're looking at the phenomenon of poetry, even in its prophetic claims and reaches. Whether inspired by the gods or not, poetry typically entails a deliberate, self-conscious crafting of a work. And the technical means, from the lyre to the electric guitar, have been employed to facilitate the visitation of the gods in Apollonian or Dionysian guises. I say guitar because I want to suggest that rock concerts may be taken seriously as festival events, releasing the energies that put people who become devotees into contact with an ecstatic reality, as a poetic event then as well, of a collective and Dionysiac nature. So the conjunction in visionary works of these two registers of meaning or expression that in principle belong to very different categories and even to disparate spheres of reality, the human and the divine, is a widespread and provocative phenomenon and forms an intriguing conundrum for critical reflection. We need to shift our focus flexibly back and forth between religious revelation and poetic creation, from poetic invention to theological disclosure, seeing them interpenetrating and working very much together throughout our histories and cultures. Poetic form is indisputably crucial to many different types of theological revelation. The recognized texts of religion are highly metaphorical and often puzzlingly enigmatic in their language. They employ myth, imaginative narrative, embellished with ornamental rhetoric, musical meters, lyrical flourishes, and emotional transports. Proverbs, psalms, songs, as well as the philosophical meditations of Ecclesiastes are all various aspects of this conjunction and concentration. And of course, Isaiah, Job are recognized as being among the sublimest poetry ever written. Um, this would go for the Book of Changes in China, for Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu as well. And it's not only the form, it's also the very inspiration, I think, of these works that is ambiguous in this way, that inspiration, the very word, straddles both religious and aesthetic semantic registers. So our language is still telling us that these two are indivisible in their intrinsic nature and origin. And of course, it's written into our theology as well, or into biblical theology. The self-revelation of divinity is understood as being consubstantial with a theologically revealed word. And such a word is necessarily understood through the workings of poetic language. The poetic and creative word functions not only as a subservient vehicle, but is also intrinsic to and constitutive of revelation itself. This language of revelation is not merely a human language that already exists and could simply be redeployed also for other profane purposes. Language as it occurs in the Bible and in poetry of the highest order is a new language. It's an emergence of language and a departure from the language as it exists. In some sense, poetry is per se a neologism. It demands to be understood as originary language, and therefore also as the language of the gods. And I think we can consider this really in two mutually counterpunctual directions. On the one hand, poetry has its origins in sacred rites and is best understood as originally a form of religious practice and expression. Through a process of secularization, songs and stories and other imaginative types of composition become detached from their originally religious contexts, such as festivals, where they are employed in ritual performance. They come to be recited in profane settings and are then transmitted as autonomous works and thus as objects of aesthetic appreciation and value. This is clearly the case with the mythopoetic works of Greece, with the Vedic myths and narratives of India. Poetry emerges as an art from originally cultic settings. But on the other hand, in modern times, which we could consider to begin with Dante in some crucial ways, poets deliberately reverse this process. They aim to turn poetic creation back into a form of ritual expression and divine revelation, la Divina Commedia, or at least of preternatural perception, visionary awareness, and prophetic pronouncements. They do so increasingly from the midst of secularized cultures in the modern world. Self-consciously creative poets have often produced and pervade their creations in imitation of the purportedly divine revelations handed down through the founding texts of the civilizations within which they lived and worked. The warrant for such returnings to religious expression lies in the originally poetic forms that are indistinguishable from prophetic and visionary revelations. So poetic form takes its shape in rhythm with its hypnotic cadences and rhyme or parallel verse structure. And this belongs to the earliest testimonies of human expression in most cultures. Now, I want to consider the origins of poetry in cultic ritual. Poetry as a language of art is generally traceable to sacred origins in cultic practices of music and dance. And again, I would suggest that it's the vocabulary that remembers this and hints it for us, the poetic foot. What is the foot, right? The basic metrical unit of poetry, if not the dancing foot of a kind of sacred dance and choreography. The word verse itself has its roots in verdere, turning. So, some kind of a sacred dancing or choreography is hinted by that term as well. Prosody as the artistic linguistic form that distinguishes itself from everyday speech, seems thus by the suggestions inherent in its vocabulary to have had its origins in the movements of dance. And of course, Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, aus dem Geist der Musik, out of the spirit of music, is really developing this connection between, in his case, ancient Attic tragedy and the choral performances of ritual music and dance and dithyrambs executed in conjunction with the festivals of the god Dionysius in ancient Greece. This common origin of poetry and prophecy in cultic ritual comes into Christian tradition from the classical world. You have deities like the Muses or the prophetesses, the Sibyls, who are transfigured by Christian hermeneutics. I think it's because they can be taken as poetic instances. There's a theological incompatibility, but they are taken on board by the Christian fathers. There's a certain ambiguity. It's just a poetic figure. The same ambiguity really still in Dante. It enables them to be baptized into Christianity, and they become very much a part of the tradition. Still, when we look at the Sistine Chapel, we have I think it's 5 Sibyls intercalated among the 7 Hebrew prophets, all looking forward to the Last Judgment. They're taken on as prophetic. And these infusions of prophetic lore from Hellenism into Christianity were massive. And even St. Augustine, in some ways, for all of his protests, gives them a kind of blessing as well. But the central figure here, I believe, is Virgil. Virgil as the pagan prophet, who then, of course, is adopted by Dante as his poetic predecessor and prophetic beacon. And even before Dante, he's widely acknowledged in medieval tradition as having prophesied, specifically in the 4th eclogue, the birth of Christ, which is really, you can prove that it's not at all what Virgil had in mind. It's a Roman consul and the birth of a son. And nevertheless, the language, under the sign of the Virgin, the birth of an extraordinary prodigy, lent itself to this interpretation in the Middle Ages. Long before Dante, there's a wonderful Christian cento by Faltona Prova, this is 4th century, composed of nothing but fragments from the Aeneid, put together in order to tell the whole story of the Bible, from the creation, the flood, all the way up to the gospel. It's all there in Virgil. So ancient poetry becomes a sort of parallel prophetic tradition, parallel to the Hebrew prophets, anticipating biblical revelation. And it's very much alive in medieval tradition. Medieval dream vision has both of these sources working in parallel, and this is what Dante does in a very systematic way then in the Commedia. This entire cross-cultural corpus now stands in need of being further contextualized in a yet wider ambit that reaches out to the forerunners of literary culture and even earlier genres in media. I've been talking about texts so far, but to really understand the phenomenon of poetry and its prophetic divinatory powers, we have to look beyond texts and literary tradition into the pre-literary history and prehistory, the immemorial background of these phenomena in magical charms and enchantments. This too belongs to the prophetic dimension of poetry. And again, it's our language which reminds us of this. The word charm derives etymologically from carmen, song in Latin. It really is a poetic song at its roots, as is enchantment. Enchantment, you have chanter, le chant, the song is in that word as well, it would be canere in Latin. So lyrical poetry can be understood as originally a sort of musical charming or word magic. I think we have documentary historical evidence of literatures beginning from spells and charms in, for example, the 10th century Old High German manuscript known as the Merseburger Zaubersprüche. It was published by Jakob Grimm in 1841. And it consists in divinatory oracles. This is really, in some ways, has a claim to being the first document of German literature. And even cross-culturally, literature originates in divination with the oracle bones of ancient China, consisting in divinatory sayings written on tortoise shells during the Shang dynasty. This is about 1600 to 1046. Magic, as a means of access to the spirit world, often uses nonsense forms of speech and phrases that transgress the norms of everyday communication, as is often the case with children's songs and their verbal play. We know this in Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear, E.E. Cummings. They're masters of this genre. And even if we think of the child magicians' hocus pocus, hocus pocus, where does that come from? If not from the rite of transubstantiation of the Holy Eucharist in the canon of the Mass, with the formulaic words, hoc est corpus meum. These familiar and often apparently banal examples can be seen as lingering reminiscences of this forgotten prehistory of poetry as destined to speak eventually with overt prophetic power. There is a kind of real efficacy in symbol and in song. The traces of word magic in former ages that I've just evoked are reminders that lyric language has real power, even when it is no longer deemed to effect cures or to inflict curses physically at a distance by the laws of magical thinking, or by what Lévi-Strauss called symbolic efficacy. L'efficacité symbolique, and Freud, die Allmacht der Gedanken, the omnipotence of thought. Lyrical verse in poetry is still thought to retain a certain kind of power over spirits. Belief is in itself powerful and influences human beings in their actions and in their way of framing their world. Now, the Roman Catholic theologian Louis-Marie Chauvet has conferred a certain kind of dignity and credibility on symbolic efficacy in his work, Symbol and Sacrament, 3 volumes, as the basis for the spiritual and world-transforming power of sacraments and liturgy. His sacramental theology leverages Heidegger's fundamental ontology and the anthropologies of Victor Turner, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Éric de Rosny in order to deeply probe the way that symbols establish and redefine human existence. His theory of the sacraments accords symbolic efficacy a philosophical and social scientific standing. Symbols are indeed constitutive of the intentional worlds we live in and construct by our linguistic means through socially significant behaviors, including verbal behaviors, and not just in a private sphere of subjective emotions. This suggests how the drift of symbols into an aesthetic register in modern secular culture might be reversed and turned back into an ontological form of efficacy. Lyrical verses, optatives, and apostrophes can still work their beneficent or maleficent effects just by pretending to induce things in the outer world to comply with human wishes. Things can be made to conform at least to the intentional representations of an inner world that can be collectively shared. I think prayer is part of this sort of phenomenon. Poetry actually creates intentional worlds, and it is far from clear that any human worlds can be created or exist at all except through such means, right? Are we ever in touch with a world stripped from all of the intentional structures that as human beings we wrap around our empirical experience already including intentions that are construed very differently in different cultures. Lyrical forms, for example, through their use of apostrophe, and even apart from and subsequent to their pragmatic application in cultic and religious rites, retain in vestigial guise their original character as magical formulas, these are invocations, that are used with an intention to symbolically transfigure and thereby to transmute the real. This can be made plausible for modern readers by identification of the spiritual powers that are invoked with the poet's own agency. Percy Shelley implores, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, to hear, oh hear," he beseeches the wind to make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. And his own words, then become the embodiment of the spirit he invokes and enjoins. "Be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth, and by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy." The poetic word is inhabited by a power to reshape and revolutionize at least our human subjective world. This power can itself be considered magical, especially in its capacity to evoke the unknown or surreal. German Romantic poetry, from early on, its expressions in Jena, circles around the word Zauber, magic. Eichendorff's Wunschelrute, the divining rod, says, "A song sleeps in all things which dream on, and the world begins to sing if only you find the magic word, das Zauberwort." But even in post-romantic, highly disenchanted times, poetry persists in fancifully representing itself as remaking the world through acts of linguistic magic and sorcery. And I think Rimbaud, his verbal alchemy would be an example for this. Rainer Maria Rilke, with his identification with the mystery cult figure Orpheus as prophet and as the urfather of his poetry. In a loosely cohesive lineage, Romantic to Surrealist poets were wont to practice poetry as a kind of conjuring of the unknown. Right? De Baudelaire au surréalisme is one of the axes of this development. All of the features of poetry are vestiges and reminders that in their most remote origins, poetic compositions were integral to cultic practices of singing and dance. They were dedicated to the gods and offered in prayer, typically as appeasement or in pleading for some kind of favored treatment or protection. They establish a kind of fellowship with the gods, and very often in Pindar's odes, poetry is speaking in the gods' own voices. But over time, the poetry of these religious festivals was transformed into a primarily aesthetic experience that includes everyday events. Homecoming, lovemaking, nature appreciation are taken up into a festive context that is reminiscent of and shows through to the remote sacred matrices. Poetry as poetic symbol and metaphor becomes a kind of religious gnosis. I worked this out in terms of Giambattista Vico's poetic logic in La Scienza Nuova. Vico being the culmination of a far-reaching tradition of Italian humanism that really can be charted from Dante, which exalts poetry as a kind of art of divination, ars divina. And there are fascinating Gnostic spin-offs of this kind of a mentality as well, from Valentinus in the 2nd century to Jakob Böhme. The specific capacity in which poetry achieves perhaps its most widely recognized revelatory potency, especially in Western culture, is as prophetic poetry in the classical epic tradition. So, having evoked this very wide and varied panorama, I do actually want to focus now on classical epic as being the matrix for the more specific senses of poetry as prophetic revelation that I want to reflect on, because the telos in some ways of the narrative that I'm constructing here is self-reflection. Self-reflection as being the driving engine in so many ways of modern culture. I want to bring prophetic poetry into the heart of self-reflection and to understand self-reflection as fundamentally poetic and prophetic. So turning the modern world's main resource, really, back to its main source, in which it is being occluded and forgotten in too many ways. Now, when we look at prophecy in the classical epic tradition, we should re-understand, I think, words like revelation. It's in a wider sense. Of course, revealed religion is part, and a crucial part, of what I want to understand by revelation. But there are also phenomenologies of revealment. There are cultic and shamanic practices of awakening and unveiling that also are essential, I think, to the full sense of revelation. The descensus ad inferas, right, the descent into hell, a shamanic visit, which is in many ways then taken up in Dante's descent into hell in the Inferno, are all part of what we can hear in this term revelation. It takes on a more specific and technical sense later on in tradition. Even in Christian tradition, early on, one spoke rather of apocalypsis, disclosure, illuminatio. Revelatio takes on its more specific sense, I think, really in scholastic tradition with the definitions of Aquinas, for example. Now, I would also like to take the word prophecy not in a narrow sense as foretelling the future. That's not what it is primarily about. So much as about seeing deeply into the overall meaning of history and the cosmos, so as to be able to interpret their truth in a way that reflects their totality, and as such is tantamount to a type of divine revelation. The prophetes, the prophet speaks for God. Now, poetry has further prophetic powers of revelation, specifically in its comprehensive form as epic narrative, which is this discourse of the whole and the origins, that combines the discursive modes of myth and typological history. Again, Virgil emerges as really the crucial pivot here. It's astonishing the way in which Virgil seems to discover something equivalent to what we call typology in biblical tradition, the way in which Aeneas becomes a figure, a type, to be fulfilled later by Augustus Caesar in so many ways. This is retrospective prophecy, as is also the case for Isaiah and in so many passages. That is, rather than predicting the future, Virgil is replaying Roman history before the eyes of the hero the ancient forebear of the Romans, Aeneas, he sees Roman history unfold before his eyes as a prophecy of the future, of what is to become on the basis of his doing at this present, in his moment. He's the one that has to achieve. He has to start. He has to start Roman history by embodying the virtues on the basis of which the Romans are going to become the mission, the people with a mission that Virgil envisages, as part, of course, of his commission from Augustus Caesar. But all of this really becomes prophetic in addressing a challenge to Virgil's own contemporaries, first and foremost Augustus Caesar himself. What is being foretold? What is foretold is how Roman history should be idealized, if it actually is going to achieve the Pax Romana that is part of the propaganda. That is what Augustus Caesar is aiming at. History has to be understood as a prophecy that remains yet to be achieved. It is a summons to action. This is really the main point about prophecy, rather than telling you either what is necessarily going to happen in the future or what has simply happened in the past. No, both of them are registers and lenses that enable you to focus the present in its full potential to become the moment of redemption. And it depends on what we do now. I think this is the sense of prophecy that then is worked out in the epic tradition. Dante sees in Virgil's retrospective prophetic history of Rome, especially as unfolded by Anchises to Aeneas, this is the sixth book of the Aeneid, something that is in effect the equivalent of scriptural typology, where the type has to be fulfilled. Right? Moses is fulfilled in Jesus on the Mount. But with that injunction, the ethical injunction, Dante then transmits this typological mode to his heirs, Tasso, Spencer, Milton. And I think this is really a fundamental building block for the kind of poetic prophecy that we still need today. And I want to show you this, particularly in the German tradition, starting with Klopstock, where I think we have the deepest theoretical probing of this prophetic poetic discourse, which then fuses with the German speculative tradition. Klopstock were in the 18th century, and the Messiah, Der Messiah, 1748 is its first publication. It's followed by his religious odes and hymns and theoretical texts as well. There's an axis here of poetic, prophetic, and revelation that I want to trace to Hölderlin, Novalis, Rilke, Stephan Georg. The phenomenology of the negative experience of incommensurability, of not being adequate to the experience of God, or more exactly, the experience of God's difference from us, figures at the heart here of Klopstock's prophetic revelations in Der Messiah. It's an aesthetics of the sublime. It's the encounter with God sets Klopstock face to face with something that is ineffable. It is really this sense of incommensurability that is foundational for the poetic prophetic experience. And for Klopstock, it really does have to be in poetry. The philosophical reasoning about God is far too subject to the illusion that God is like us and can be understood by our intellectual powers and principles. It's the radical difference of the divine from the human subject which is the core of Klopstock's of his experience. He moves prophecy beyond any rational power of control over itself. The soul experiences a dynamic being moved, Bewegtheit, in its contact with the holy. And the limits of expression are reached. He is reduced to dumb marvel of astonishment, Staunen, witnessing to our infinite bottomless inferiority. Now, Klopstock understands art as the highest expression of life and as the best way for us to think about God, and emphasizes how our language is deficient. This is like Dante in the Paradiso with the ineffability topos, the constant recurring to the impotence of language as a method of elevating the soul to the vision of God. In Hölderlin, the next step here, such theoretical reflection on poetry becomes integral to the poetry itself. The theoretical reflection was coming from the essays by Klopstock that I just ran through very rapidly. Poetry eventually subverts, the theoretical reflection of Hölderlin eventually even subverts the poetic enterprise, which comes to an impasse. Now, the self-reflexivity of the Enlightenment subject as the highest pinnacle of knowledge, reflected in the Kantian transcendental unity of apperception, emerges as, in principle, the ground for prophetic revelation. This is very much on Hölderlin's mind. As a poet, nevertheless, the consciousness, the transcendental unity of apperception, a consciousness that would underlie every consciousness, any consciousness of an object, becomes the basis, I think, for a kind of speculative sense of prophetic revelation. This unity, however, the unity of apperception is not compatible with the subject-object structure of conceptual knowing and with goal-directed acting. It can be won back, according to Hölderlin, only through mythic representation in poetry, to try and represent the whole. We have to take recourse to myths, the infinite whole of being. It exceeds any kind of rational conceptuality. There's some sort of a possibility of rendering it, of expressing it in poetry. At least this is what Hölderlin is reaching after. In the end, he seems to fail. The difference between the human and the holy tears a rift in Hölderlin's outlook. His elected alter ego Empedocles is constrained to suicide in order to atone for the prophetic guilt he incurs by his revelatory speaking out. He threw himself into Mount Etna. Speaking the unspeakable, he betrays the godly and therefore has to annihilate himself. His sacrilege condemns him to suicide. Hölderlin actually pursues the vocation of the poet to become prophet to the limits of its possibilities and even to the loss and dispersal of poetry itself. Mediating the perspective of German idealism, Hölderlin brings the pagan quest for revelation through universal nature and mind together with an understanding of prophetic poetry as an extension of revealed religion. Both of these traditions are very much in play. But the aporia of any attempt to represent the divine results in a renunciation of the prophetic pretensions of the poet and an admission of the inevitably fictive nature of poetry. Poetry that pretends to be mediating the self-revelation of the divine turns out to be self-deceptive. The principle of an absolute difference between the human and the divine ultimately defeats such attempts. And Hölderlin enters consequently into a night which leaves us only the trace of the departed gods. His hymn Patmos traces in exquisite detail the excruciating steps and stages of the Via Crucis, this Calvary of poetry. It moves from the potential of realizing Enlightenment ideals concretely in universal spiritual community, prefigured by the disciples gathered around Christ, to portraying poetry's being capable only of tragedy and of expressing the shipwreck of human aspirations to fullness of meaning in the unfolding of absolute spirit. In Patmos, Hölderlin attempts dialectically to turn the loss of the physical presence of God in Christ among his disciples into a positive and productive form of anamnesis. St. John, on the island of Patmos, through visionary channels and modalities, remembers Jesus' life on earth and his going away. He wrestles with the paradoxical nearness and yet ungraspable nature of the divine. Nah ist und schwer zu fassen der Gott. This difficult to grasp nearness is, we could understand this as being the subject's own transcendental apperception that is present everywhere in conscious experience, but nowhere as an object that can be grasped. Because it's rather the unobjectifiable form of all experience. It's near, nothing is nearer than consciousness itself, and yet we never can grasp it, just like God. What we have are the traces of divinity that can be followed, and there's the image of sowing as well. Jesus' parable of the sower disseminating the seeds of divine revelation comes in where the direct vision fails. We're in times of dearth with Hölderlin. Poetry serves rather as a hermeneutic method for interpreting the letter of Holy Scripture. This is the vocation of German song. So Hölderlin's transcendental philosophical reflection on poetry as revelation and the impasse he encounters is pursued to a different result by his romantic contemporaries and successors. The dialectical self-negation of poetry as prophecy, in which Hölderlin's aspirations met with defeat, is given a more affirmative and triumphant spin by Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel. For them, although there is no direct or adequate language for expressing the transcendent, still indirectly, language used in formally innovative and creative ways can effectively symbolize and communicate something that transcends representation. Now, I do want to go a little bit further with this line of the taking self-reflection to its limit in this German speculative tradition, which gives us, I think, some of the deepest theoretical insight into the whole history and nature of poetic prophecy. But I want to see it also in a wider purview, including the other European traditions, building from this classical epic that also go through various forms of secularization. Because the self-reflection is a form of secularization. It does not have to be the exclusion of our awareness and experience of the holy, quite the contrary. You have less of this self-reflective focus, but the English Romantics, too, are deeply invested in understanding poetry as transcendent theological revelation, with the emphasis more on the reenactment of spiritual vision conveyed exemplarily in the Bible than on transcendental philosophical reflection. The human imagination is recognized as the source of a creative shaping power from which the whole universe, as humanly experienced, arises. Of course, Blake tells us men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. So there is this secularizing move, even in as brilliantly theological as programmatically theological a poet as Blake. Now, French Romantics, a little bit later, they too have there's, starting with the Romantics, there's a fascination with Mohammed and a kind of religious revelation. But French Romanticism's affair with prophetic inspiration is stimulated especially by narcotics that are used to induce ecstatic experience. Baudelaire, Les Paradis Artificiels. There is this emphasis on a kind of artificiality and the role of drugs when we think of Rimbaud and up to the surrealists, Henri Michaud, Misérable Miracle, La Mescaline. There's a kind of a destiny that comes out especially in this French line to bring the poetic, prophetic, visionary moment into a very close contact with the experience of narcotics. Of course, it's there from shamanism. It's there all along. It does, I think, come out specifically and especially in this French lineage that can also cast discredit in some ways on poetic prophecy, and it does have its critics. There are many philosophers, of course, who have given us devastating critiques of prophetic prophecy, from Francis Bacon to Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, Montaigne, Hegel, Karl Popper, Arthur Danto. Nevertheless, it may be precisely prophecy's loss in modern times of credibility in its original function as integral to the religious cult that has freed it for its most audacious exploits in creative arts and literary applications. Literary transmogrifications of prophetic revelation can be seen as redefining rather than undermining it.
Can you take like 5 more minutes?
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, William.
Yeah. The return of the pagan gods comes back in a vengeance in this tradition of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Verlaine. The gods come out of the niches of the cathedrals and the rubrics of rhetoric into the modern metropolis. This is the way in which Verlaine depicts their return. They're en campagne, enragés. So these secular manifestations of the prophetic and poetic, and certainly the unconscious would give us other versions with psychoanalysis, and even I think the miracles of telecommunications in our own time give rise to a kind of omnipotence, omnipresence, a sort of kingdom come in virtual hyperreality, a realized eschatology. I think this too is another secular version of what I'm describing as poetic prophecy. In this case, it seems that the veil of mystery over poetic creation has been completely torn away. But there might be a more reverent reading of what I would call Hölderlin's legacy, one that remains in awe of religion and that recognizes its ground in unknowing. So there's another secularity, the negative way, which I wanted to trace here from Klopstock, who does make the lyric subject the locus for revelation. It does become a matter of the feeling of an absolute incommensurability and all of the declarations of ineffability that follow. But it's not merely subjective. Any representation of self, of course, is always partial and distorting. These romantic German poets are working very much in dialogue with the transcendental philosophy of Fichte, this transcendental I. But it turns out that the I can only be apprehended negatively. I think this is really the lesson of the poets. And Novalis with the Hymnen an die Nacht, it becomes, they find another mode of expression, whereas Hölderlin found himself at a kind of an impasse and went mad. The German romantic poets following him, like Novalis, are able to enter into this negativity, this absolute negative. They're able to enter into that space and explore it and express it. It becomes a kind of a via negativa, indirectly expressing the unrepresentable, a wholly nothing that is unknown and nameless. This is a quote from Novalis. Poetry can express the feeling of absolute dependence, a loss and incompleteness that enables a self-affection of a higher I and divine ground. Now, the problem here, in the eyes of many, is that it seems to reduce to a mere feeling of oneself, Selbstgefühl. This seems to many to be a kind of dead end for prophetic poetry. Does it just end? I don't think that's at all the case. This Selbstgefühl the self has been broken open into the infinite and into an encounter with an unknowable God. However, to try and give this a kind of concrete content, where I end up, and I think I'm not going to read the section on Walt Whitman, but I will just mention that Whitman gives us it is a self-reflective approach to prophetic poetry. It's all about the self, the song of the self. I celebrate myself. There's even a Christic narrative. He looks upon himself as a kind of suffering Christ, and it's eroticized. A cosmic eroticism is written into this experience. It's self-reflection that is embodied. It's the body that becomes the locus for a kind of self-reflection that cannot be contained within consciousness. There's a reflection that has really exceeded the Cartesian cogito. This is the direction, I think, that many today are looking to extend the heritage of prophetic poetry in this bursting open of self-reflection into an incarnate ecstasy. And I would then just end by suggesting that I think this enables us to renovate even the vocabulary of the eternal, of truth. These are terms that we've lost our ability to use in so many ways. But it becomes possible by opening them to the infinite in the way that the prophetic poets, on this course of self-reflection and really to the absolute limit of self-reflection, to the breaking point of self-reflection, have enabled us in our post-secular times now to reopen these pre-modern idioms that spoke and sang the notes of truth and eternity to untold generations of our forebears. So this is the heritage that I'm trying to resuscitate. Thank you.
In the Catholic tradition, we're enjoined every day to make several petitions. One, that we not be led into temptation. Another, that one might have an easy death. And yet another, that one might escape final damnation. And I think I'd like to add a fourth, that I would like to be saved from having to respond to William Franke. Because, as you know, William knows everything. And his papers are not just synoptic, as he modestly said, but they're panoptic. And this means for the poor soul who has to respond, there's not really even a crack you can crawl into to explore. So I'm not going to say anything much about the prophetic. I just want to add a few little curlicues which perhaps give slightly different perspectives on how we might articulate religion and the arts. The first of these is to do with the notion of sacrament. Now, it used to be, until the 12th century, that we had, I think, 21 or 22 sacraments in the Latin West, which included such things as coronations, foot washing, and so forth. And it was Hugh of St. Victor and Peter Lombard who whittled the number of sacraments down to 7, which we still have today. But in doing this, they didn't get rid of the other sacraments at all. They just became reclassified as sacramentals. And these are still in play, certainly in the Catholic Church. A sacramental is when you bless yourself, when you genuflect, when you say grace, when you sprinkle holy water, and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly, the Catholic Church, which likes to delimit anything it can get its hands on, has never actually delimited the number of sacramentals. There's no limit to sacramentals. Why? Because there's no limit we can place on the way in which God comes into the world. Theologians have as an occupational hazard telling God what he can and can't do, but God generally doesn't listen to theologians. He comes in any way he wishes into the world. So this means, of course, that no theologian, no cardinal, no pope, no one has the right to say that God cannot manifest God's self in and through the reading of a poem, the listening to music, the viewing of an artwork, or indeed the making of all of these things. A sacrament, strictly speaking, contains what it signifies. But a sacramental doesn't contain what it signifies at all. It keeps disseminating the meaning. So we don't have, as a French distinction, between l'avenir, the future, and avenir, that which is to come. In a sacramental, it's always God who may be there, but God who's always still to come. There are endlessly new possibilities of a relationship with God, which can be found in the reading of a poem, in the writing of a poem, and so on and so forth with all the other arts. The other thing is, of course, with some poems, not all poems, not some artworks, some paintings, not all paintings, and so on, some music, not all music, it can function as a kind of prayer. And That's to say, all prayer, all human prayer, is always belated. God has always come beforehand. God is always anterior to our prayer. No human being has ever initiated a prayer. They only come in belated response to the divine invitation to be in conversation. Some prayers are very simple, of the kind, help me, or thank you. But the kinds of prayers that we have in poems are, I like to think of, choric responses to the invitation of God. Not a simple response, but a choric one, which is rich in metaphor, simile, rhythm, meter, and so on and so forth, with often, as occurs in poetry, the multiplication of voices and idioms. So it's as though the prayer that is called forth is calling forth more than one is. And the meaning of the relationship one might well have with God is never contained. It's always avenir. There's always more to come. And the final one I want to mention, just to keep William's ideas in play, perhaps from a different perspective, is what I call the iconic moment. Poems and artworks are not always icons, very, very rarely. But a lot of literature, a lot of art, has what I call an iconic moment. And this is when something strange happens, which is readers and viewers of art and listeners to music, that you might be familiar with, if you think of it. Often when we're reading a poem, say, our gaze is upon the poem and we are trying to seek the meaning or meanings of the poem. But there's often a moment where the poem gazes back at you. A good example of this is in George Herbert's poem The Collar, where right at the end of the poem, it's not the speaker having his tantrum, it's God who suddenly speaks in the poem and silences it. Or Rainer Maria Rilke, in his wonderful sonnet about the archaic torso of Apollo, where gazing at the torso, one is not simply retaining the artwork, or the aesthetic value. At a certain stage, the torso says, you must change your life. And there's a kind of flip where you are caught in the gaze of the artwork. This happens in a great number of artworks, and I think it's an instance not where we can overlay all that we know about icons onto them, but we can see particular moments where what we know of icons can actually enrich our relationship with a poem or a painting or indeed a piece of music. And all these things are, I suspect, contained in what William has said. I'm just replaying them in a slightly different idiom. Thank you.